History 386, U.S. Poverty in the Midst of Prosperity. This is week 1. First of all, a little disclaimer. Online classes, because of their very nature, are demanding. They require a great deal of self-discipline and self-motivation. Now, in addition to that, this is an accelerated 8-week course. So we will be covering, within 8 weeks, the same amount of material that we normally cover in a 16-week course. So things are going twice as fast. Because we are not meeting in a face-to-face format, that means that we need to leave the lines of communication open in other ways. Please know that I absolutely love teaching, and I've been the recipient of quite a number of teaching awards, including one for the entire Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky region. So I'm here to help you if you have any questions or concerns. I always want my students to learn. Feel free to email me. My email address is listed there as well as on the syllabus, or to call my cell phone, and you'll find that my response time is usually very quick. Please know that I do not use text messaging. It is not a part of my cell phone contract. Now, it's one of the first things that you need to do for any class, and certainly for an online class, is to go ahead and to download the syllabus, print it out, study it, read it over thoroughly. I'm going to cover a few of the major assignments, not everything that's contained within the syllabus, within the context of this first lecture for week 1. There will be an icebreaker, which is worth 20 points, where you simply introduce yourself. It's explained in the syllabus. Then there will be 7 discussions, each worth 100 points each, for a total of 700 points, and a final reflective paper of 100 points. All of those add up to 820 points, but actually 800 points is an AAA plus, right? It's the equivalent of a 100 in this class. So what I've done is actually included 20 built-in extra credit points, what I call my self-service extra credit. So it's really important. Basically, the icebreaker is the extra credit, in other words. So it's important that you go ahead and submit the icebreaker, because you never know when you may need those points later on. This is the breakdown, so you can follow along at the end of the class, at the end of the 8 weeks, and see what your number of points are and what that is in terms of the percentages, whether it's an A or an A minus, etc. Now, please know that the Blackboard grading site does not completely comprehend, nor have we found a way to make it comprehend, my system of 20 points of built-in self-service credit. So the Blackboard grading system always thinks that everything is being taken out of 820 points, and that 820 points is the equivalent of a 100, and it's not. So if at any particular point in time, week 2, 3, 4, etc., you're looking at it and it's saying that you're getting B and you really think you're getting an A, just get in contact with me and I'll clarify that for you. Again, it's probably a Blackboard system problem. Please know that when I determine final grades, I use Excel and spreadsheets and all kinds of other systems. I do not use the Blackboard system. Discussions. Now, there'll be 7 discussion boards as outlined in the assignments section of the syllabus, also under the weekly assignments link on the class Blackboard site. For each discussion, I will create, as your professor, a discussion thread, and I'll give you a prompt or prompts. That is, I'll give you a kind of a question or two, a topic or two, to get things started. The first student then to reply to my thread should comment thoughtfully on at least one of those prompts, but at any point in time, that student or any other students can continue with one of the prompts that I introduced, or you can introduce topics of your own. Now, I'm the only one that can create the discussion thread in this class, so basically that's all you need to do to reply is, you're reading through the different discussions, and then you put together your own 500-word discussion. Now, you're probably going to be doing that in a Word or an RTF rich text format file, and when you're done with that, you want to take your discussion and you want to cut and paste it into the discussion board. Okay, you want to do that, which is this right here. But in addition to that, you also want to hit the little paperclip icon and upload your Word file or your RTF file as an attachment. So again, you're doing two things. You're clicking reply, you're uploading your 500-word discussion as an attachment. And the reason why that's necessary is I need the attachment in order to open up the Word file and to do my grading and to return your graded paper to you. And then you're also cutting and pasting from that Word file directly into the discussion board itself and then hitting submit at the end. And that enables the other students in the class to read the discussion post without having to open each and every student's individual Word attachment, which is very time consuming. Now remember, at the end of these two things, you need to click submit. It's very important to click submit for all of the things to take. Discussions are usually due on Sundays by 11:59 p.m. Everything will be very clear and concise for you under weekly assignments in the class Blackboard on the class Blackboard site. Please know as well that I know that many of you are working full-time, maybe you have family obligations, children, etc., and that you have many obligations in your life. And so I know sometimes life happens and life gets in the way and sometimes you fall behind. Please note that I always do accept late assignments. I don't encourage them, but I do accept them, and I never deduct points for their being late. And so try to keep with the deadlines. The deadlines are made to help you as a student keep up with the class and finish it in a timely manner, especially since it's only an 8-week class. If you fall a little bit behind, fine, but please don't fall too far behind, and you can certainly work ahead as well. Now, I have a very, I think, clear and concise grading rubric. Every time you do a discussion, you should, as you're writing your discussion up, you should you should print this thing out, this rubric out, put it in front of you, and be familiar with it, and it defines for you exactly where the point systems lie. And 4 very easy to follow columns. Let's look at the first column, which is worth 20 points. Each week in the weekly assignments, you'll be given assigned readings either from your textbook or from other works which I've gone ahead and scanned and put in PDF files on the weekly assignment pages for you in the class Blackboard site. These we call our assigned readings. These are the things that everyone needs to read. Now, in this category, I want to make certain that you've read and understood the assigned readings. I do give a lot of readings, and I expect you to be able to skim through those readings. You know, no one is really expecting you to read everything word for word unless you happen to be some sort of speed reader. But you're to read and you're to get the main ideas, and as well as to understand where the readings are going and what kind of evidence is there to support the main ideas. Now, so the 10 points is evidence in your discussion of having read and understood the assigned reading. 10 points is your ability to at least use one in-text note referencing one of the assigned readings. And I'm going to show you here in a few minutes what an in-text note is. Basically, it's the same thing as a footnote, except it's done within the text itself, hence the name in-text note. 30 points are unassigned readings. So in addition to the assigned readings, I expect you to research, read, and understand at least one unassigned reading of your choice from a scholarly source. A scholarly source does not include .com or Wikipedia or Encarta or Britannica, a dictionary, a Bible, the Quran, or anything else. I will show you here in a minute how to find a scholarly source. If you are uncertain whether something is a scholarly source or not, please feel free to contact me. So, you're reading assigned readings You're showing me you read them and understood them. That doesn't mean that you have to summarize them. You know, we're not looking for a summary. We're not looking for a Cliff's Notes kind of version of everything that happened. It would not be possible in 500 words in a discussion to summarize all of your readings. That's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is that you've convinced me, you've read and understood the assigned readings, and you can use an in-text note to those assigned readings. It's also to convince me that you know how to find unassigned reading, at least one unassigned reading of your own choice. So this is kind of the research part of things. So what interests you in the assigned readings for that week? Is there a particular topic? Is there a particular theme? If so, just go ahead and run with that topic or theme. Find another unassigned reading from a scholarly source and go ahead and talk about that in your discussion. Now, I also want you to make at least one reference, that is one in-text note, to your chosen unassigned source as well. So you're going to do at least 2 in-text notes in each discussion. One in-text note will refer to one of the assigned readings. The other in-text note will refer to at least one of your unassigned readings. Then, since an in-text note doesn't give you all of the information, I feel that each and every one of my students needs to know how to do a bibliography, which I'm going to show you here in a minute as well. And that should be in proper form, which we're going to show you as well. Note that since you're really only finding one unassigned reading, the bibliography really only needs to have one citation in it, that one unassigned reading. If you decide to do more unassigned readings, you would put those in your bibliography. 30 points are objectivity, critical thinking, and originality, divided into 10 points each. So 10 points, objectivity. In the discussion, you want to show me evidence that you've using those readings and lectures to understand the material fully and objectively. Each and every one of us kind of comes to whatever topic or class that we're discussing, and sometimes we have certain viewpoints and perspectives, certain prejudices, and we know that in college, no matter what discipline you're studying, no matter what major you're in, that we try to understand the material fully and objectively, and that is as objectively as possible. To look at both sides of an issue and to not let our emotions get involved. 10 points are your use of critical thinking skills as evidenced by analysis and synthesis of material, and I'll show you what that means here in a minute. 10 points, originality, that is contributing to the discussion through thoughtful analysis and synthesis, not simply repeating what a prior class member has already stated. Now that assumes that you are doing as you're expected to do and read through the discussion posting. So before you post your discussion, you need to be reading all of the other discussion postings from your fellow students. And you're not simply to repeat what other people have said. You know, the point is not to say I agree or disagree. The point is to add something new and original to the conversation. That new and original is the result of your own reading and of your own studying and your own research. And 20 points is simply mechanics. That is really the ability to follow instructions. 5 points, proper grammar and spelling. At least 500 words in length, 5 points, but note, as this asterisk says, that essays that are too short may also lose points in other categories, since they may not adequately address stated requirements in those categories. And then, as we just discussed, you want to do 2 things when you reply to a posting. That is, you want to cut and paste your essay into the discussion board so that other students can easily follow it and read it. And then you also want to upload your essay as a Word attachment using the little file clip icon so that I can go in and I can do my grading, make revisions and suggestions, and send it back to you. Any questions with this, please feel free to contact me. So we talked a little bit about that one column, that third column, where you're going to be required to do critical thinking. I like to think of critical thinking as really connecting the dots. You may remember as a child that sometimes you would have these little kind of puzzles that had all kinds of little dots, and you had to connect the dots in the proper order, and then once you did that, you would see a nice little illustration. Or maybe perhaps you put puzzles together and you looked at the picture of the puzzle on the puzzle box. You saw what it was supposed to look like, and then you took all of those pieces and put them together. Well, critical thinking is really that. It's your ability to read the assigned readings, to listen to my lectures, and to research and find your own and read your own unassigned readings, and to kind of put that all together and synthesize it. And in some cases, you know it's going to be a lot of pages that you're reading, and add that to the lectures, and you say, boy, it may seem overwhelming. But the first part of critical thinking is to synthesize. Synthesis literally means to piece together. So it's no different than what you did as a child when you connected the dots or you put puzzles together. You've got many, many different pieces. You don't let it overwhelm you. You just try to put the pieces together. Now, just because you've put the pieces together doesn't mean that your audience, that is me or your fellow students, that we're going to take your word for it. Prove it, we'll say. Make us see how it fits all together. And these are the things you don't obviously want to do. This is a little comical view of trying to prove things. And you prove things through evidence. You prove things through the second part of critical thinking, which is analysis. And just like synthesis means to pull together, analysis, anytime you see this kind of ANA, means to separate, to pull apart, to separate into parts so that you can see how the parts relate to one another and to the entire whole. Now, obviously, as I said before, in a 500-word discussion post each week, you cannot look at the entire puzzle. You cannot look at all of the pieces. You cannot summarize everything in all of the assigned and your unassigned reading. It would be impossible to do that, and I'm not expecting you to do that. What rather I want you to do is choose one or two pieces, perhaps, of that puzzle, to take those one or two pieces out, to put them back in, to show everyone how it fits into the overall big picture. And you do that step by step by using evidence. You lead your audience to your conclusion by using evidence. But we might ask, what is evidence? Well, you make a claim. Let's say, for instance, you claim that many immigrants from Eastern Europe who came to the United States were poor. Okay, so what do you know? That's your claim. How do you know that? What's your evidence? Where did you read that? In your assigned readings? Did you listen to it in my lecture? How about your unassigned reading? And then you use your reasoning, your critical thinking skills, your synthesis and analysis skills to show that how your evidence really supports your claim. That is how evidence works. In other words, you need to use your reasoning. That is your critical thinking skills of synthesis and analysis. Critical thinking, I always say, is like any learning in life. Learning how to ride a bike, how to swim. It takes a coach, this would be me, the coach, and practice, but the coach can't ride the bike for you, can't swim for you. He can only give you an understanding of how to do that, and through practice you do it yourself. So to review, my lectures and the assigned readings give you the initial pieces of the puzzle. Your research and reading of your chosen unassigned source gives you more pieces of the puzzle. Then I will give you prompts to provide you in your discussions a sense of what the puzzle picture might look like. And then you need to show your readers, your classmates, in the discussion postings what the assembled puzzle looks like and to describe to them how you put the pieces together or put just a couple of the pieces together by using evidence, that is, analysis. Now, we said that the discussions also need to include at least 2 in-text notes, sometimes called in-text footnotes. And this is how you do an in-text note. An in-text note is the same thing as a footnote, except it's within the text itself and it's much, much shorter. So here we've taken from a book some information and we've summarized this demographic information about population in China. And we want to show that we did not make that source up. I mean, we didn't just think this up, that this is truly a factual matter, a fact. So we go ahead and put a parentheses, last name of the author, skip a space, the year of publication, comma, and a page number, okay, where we got that from. That's called an in-text note. You're going to do at least 2 of these each discussion. One of them is going to reference something in one of your assigned readings. The other, second in-text note, is going to reference something in the reading, the unassigned reading that you find from a scholarly source. Now, I'm assuming that all of you know what plagiarism is. You need to familiarize yourself with all 6 parts of this. And remember that whenever you're quoting or using something word for word from a book or other source, an article, that you need to put it in quotation marks and you need to do a footnote, do an in-text note. There are other things that need to be noted as well, and they're all given here. And there are other things that you should certainly avoid, like getting papers or presentations from a classmate or some kind of website or service. Please know that our Blackboard system here at the university enables all of us, and I use this, to use plagiarism software. So it is very good and sophisticated plagiarism software, and I even allow the students to see how it determines if any of their paper is plagiarism. So please do not at any particular point plagiarize, and if you have any questions about this, please call me. Okay, so if you take something word for word and quote it, you need to put it in quotation marks and footnote it, and here shows you an in-text note. If you take something that's really, really long and decide to quote it, then you need to do a block quotation, which means it needs to go into single spacing like this, and it needs to be put in like this, indent it, and again footnote it. Even if you're paraphrasing things and not doing things word for word, for instance, you're taking the information here and rephrasing it, but it is very specific, factual, demographic information. You don't walk around knowing these kind of facts, so your reader's going to say, where did you get that from? And this is where you show that, where you got that information from. Now, you do not have to be obsessive, kind of compulsive about this. You don't need to worry about footnoting something that is generally known or widely disseminated information, and I give you some examples here, and those are merely examples. Again, if you have any questions or need any clarifications, please contact me. And avoiding plagiarism, again, if you ever use any kind of illustration or graph and you didn't make it up, then you need to source that out. And then remember what we said is that each discussion posting for every week, each week needs to have a bibliography. Sometimes that may mean that if you only used one unassigned source, that you only have one item in your bibliography. Doesn't matter. I need to see that you know how to use a bibliography, that you know how to cite things, and that you know how to cite it correctly. This is what a bibliography includes. In history, we use the Chicago, also called the Turabian style. Great news is a free program is available to assist you with correctly formatting your bibliographic references, and that's available via the citation machine, which allows you to do Chicago or Turabian style. I believe it's in a kind of a drop-down list. If you need help in using that, let me know. I'm also going to give you plenty of bibliographic citations in the Chicago or Turabian style at the end of this lecture of PowerPoint. But again, I don't want to, in the middle of a PowerPoint that's the first week's lecture, get too detailed, so that will be at the end of this lecture. Now, how do you find your unassigned scholarly sources? Well, you're probably going to want to go to a database, a digital database, such as what we have here at Steele Library at NKU. So if you go to nku.edu, in the upper right-hand corner, if you click the drop-down list, you can click Library Steele. And then if you want to use any databases, it's going to obviously ask you for a username password. If you need any assistance with that, you can call IT 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that number is in your syllabus. So let's say you want to go ahead and find some databases. I suggest that you might want to use one of these 3 databases. These are commonly used in history and for the humanities. The first one is called JSTOR. Of course, it'll be under the A databases. JSTOR literally stands for Journal Storage, and it contains, many, I guess probably now millions of articles from many different journals. So if, for instance, you were interested in Eastern European or say Eastern European Jewish immigration, you could easily put in those kind of key phrases and find articles in JSTOR. The same is true of Academic Search Complete and of Project Muse. Now, starting with week 6, we're going to shift from kind of a history of poverty to more recent times. And discussion 6, as well as 7, will deal with some kind of virtual role-playing. You might want to call that anyhow. You will be asked to examine current resources that are available to alleviate poverty in the community where you live. For those living, as many of you do, in Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, Southeastern Indiana, otherwise known as kind of the greater Cincinnati metropolitan area, I provide a lengthy list of acceptable websites of community agencies at the end of the syllabus. However, it's not an exhaustive list, and you're free to choose others not on the list. And if you have any questions or need clarification, please contact me. For those living elsewhere in the United States, it's suggested that you find agencies in your particular area. Again, you can contact me for clarification. For those living overseas, you might want to consult agencies anywhere where you last lived, or perhaps where you lived the longest when you were living in the United States. Now, we're going to begin our poverty studies. And I first want to tell you a little bit about myself and how I became interested in poverty studies. The story really is told through a wonderful, well-known person, a great humanitarian, Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was born in Albania, and she decided to become a sister, and she went and joined an order of nuns in Ireland, where she received training, and then in 1929 she went to India. And there initially she taught history and geography at a all-girls Catholic high school, and this was mainly for upper-class girls in India. And, while she enjoyed her work teaching history and geography, she nonetheless felt this greater calling to work with the poor of India. And that's where she, got permission to form her own religious association within the Catholic Church called the Missionaries of Charity. And these sisters, these nuns, worked among the poorest of the poor, literally pulling people out of the gutters of Calcutta where they were dying. They were homeless. They had no friends or no family to take care of them, and giving them a place to stay, healing their wounds, and allowing them to either get better, to recover, or to die in dignity. And her story is well known worldwide. Her story may not have been well known worldwide had it not been from somebody from the Cincinnati area, namely a wonderful lady who was a good friend of mine, Helen McNeve Tyson, here, now deceased, who was from Covington, Kentucky. So Helen McNeve Tyson in 1960 was president of the National Council of Catholic Women in the United States. The National Council of Catholic Women at that time had 13,000 chapters nationwide, and over 9 million women were members. That year in 1960, they decided to have their national convention, and of all places, Las Vegas, Nevada. And the kind of topic of discussion, the theme of the convention, was women in the 1960s. And so Helen Tyson and her friend Eileen Egan, who worked for Catholic Relief Services in Washington, D.C., decided to ask a little-known nun, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, to come and be the main speaker at their national convention in 1960 in Las Vegas. Remember I said Mother Teresa went to India in 1929? She had never left India from 1929 to 1960. 1960 was the first time she left India. And Helen Tyson, my friend, and Eileen Egan were responsible for bringing her to the United States and really for introducing her to the United States. And from that point on, the rest is history. She became a household name, not only in the United States, but worldwide for her great humanitarian work. In 1982, Helen Tyson was influential in bringing Mother Teresa to speak to Covington, Kentucky. And then from Covington, Kentucky, she went on down into eastern Kentucky, the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where her sisters had recently founded a mission there to work with the poor. I was a very fortunate person to attend her talk in Covington in 1982 and to see Mother Teresa in person. Helen Tyson was a friend of, obviously, along with her sister, Rosemary McNeve. These two were sisters. They were friends of Mother Teresa. They visited her in India. They sponsored some of her children, and they acted as consultants to her, especially later on when her first enterprise in the United States was opening a hospice for AIDS patients in New York City, and they helped her with that venture as well. Other things I've done in terms of dealing with poverty were with a major project with Dr. Brian Hackett of NKU, an exhibit in a book on St. Elizabeth Medical Center. St. Elizabeth Medical Center, formerly known as St. Elizabeth Hospital, is the largest employer in northern Kentucky. And it was formed by two wonderful, wealthy, upper-class women who were converts to Catholicism, Henrietta Esther Scott Cleveland and Sarah Worthington King Peter. You'll be reading a little bit about Henrietta Esther Scott Cleveland's life in one of our readings. Both of these women had very hard lives. Even though they were wealthy, they had a lot of sorrow and suffering and death in their lives. And rather than choose to concentrate or focus on that suffering, they went outside of themselves and decided to help others and performed many charitable deeds, including, among many things, the foundation of St. Elizabeth Hospital. And hospitals back then were really for poor people. Now what is this class about? This class examines poverty, prosperity, and the economic development of the United States. It's impossible to discuss any of those topics, especially from the 19th century to the present day, without discussing the global economy and such things as industrialization, urbanization, imperialism, and globalization, all of which, by the way, I've studied very deeply and have researched and written about as well. These intricate connections mean that we'll be referring quite often to other parts of the world. World news today is filled with references to the global economy, particularly news about the growing inequality gap both within individual nations and also between nations. Whether you're conservative, liberal, or right smack in the middle, you depend upon the global economy for more than you may realize. All of us benefit when the economy works well, and all of us suffer when it does not. This course is designed to introduce you to the terminology, the history, the themes, even the rhetoric of the arguments made by many different voices and viewpoints on the economic stage. In order to ensure that we are all on the same level playing field, I'll introduce you to some vocabulary and concepts in this first lecture. These are very important to understanding everything that happens in this class. Sit back, listen, read, and let the terms and concepts sink in. They won't all sink in at once. You'll hear and read them again and again, so don't worry if they seem foreign or strange to you now. By the end of the class, it will all seem to start to come together, and maybe even before. And guess what? Many, if not most, of those historical economic explanations and theories were focused on one cause, one problem, one solution, one remedy, one silver bullet to fix it all. However, history and the economy are both complex things. If there were a silver bullet, millions of human beings would have discovered it by now. So let's throw aside our collective hubris and admit that all of us, including me, have much to learn. In other words, if you think you have all of the answers, you're probably not asking the right questions. To ask the right questions, we first of all need to realize that history is the study of change over time and place. And that might seem strange, that definition, because sometimes we think that history is something static, that it's totally in the past, that it's boring, that it's never changes. But what do I say? History is the study of change over time and place. If there wasn't change, we wouldn't need to study history. Hence, our questions and themes change depending upon the historical period that we're discussing, and the questions may change depending upon which civilization we are discussing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about American civilization, about American culture here in a minute. And civilization is humankind's attempt to bring stability and meaning to that uncertain and changing world. If the economy were stable and we didn't experience recessions and depressions and unemployment and such things as that, we wouldn't have this course to study. Successful civilizations monitor all of their conditions, political, military, economic. They recognize and reward successful leaders. They learn from their mistakes. Those leaders are flexible to changing conditions. Because history has changed, unsuccessful civilizations are out of touch with that change, with that reality, and they tend to become complacent or inflexible. So, as Dr. Tenkate says, good leaders learn from their mistakes. Bad leaders seldom learn from their own mistakes. And even worse, they often blame others for their mistakes. We generally call such leaders demagogues. Mediocre leaders sometimes learn from their own mistakes. But good leaders and good students, like you and I, learn from our own mistakes as well as the mistakes of others. So, we said it's very important to look at a civilization, to look at a culture. So this first thing is kind of a cultural, social overview of where does the United States, and I'm asking you, where does the U.S. fit on this continuum? On the one end, there are societies like Japan, or China, or Korea, or India that are more communalistic. That is, there, the group is important. And the group depends upon whatever situation you're in. It might be your workplace, it might be your school, it might be your family, it might be your extended family. But in communalism, and in societies which practice it more, the group is the most important thing, not the individual. Hence, the group is the most important decision-making body. And that group wants, whatever group it is, to maintain harmony, to come to some sort of compromise and consensus. Well, this is very typical of some of those Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asian cultures that I've just referenced. Over here, we have more Western civilization, the United States and Europe, where we place primary importance on the individual and on individual decision-making. And what that really becomes then is a majority rules kind of culture. Well, where are we, the U.S., on this continuum? Is it way, way over here? Is it somewhere here? Is it somewhere here? Where do you fit on this continuum? And please note that on any kind of continuum, there are possible dangers on the extreme ends. Over here, too much communalism can mean and be dangerous, where the individual can be ignored. We saw this happen in Japanese and German history when World War II occurred, and the Holocaust, and the horrible crises and suffering that World War II brought. If we have too much individualism, we can find out that the result is selfishness, greed, and gridlock, especially when it comes to trying to get things through, say, a governmental body. So, now with the big overview of the culture behind us, let us try to define who are the poor. Defining poverty or prosperity throughout history is like trying to hit a moving target. Before the Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century, the vast majority of people in any nation or civilization, including the United States, were poor peasant farmers, as high as 90% or more. By our modern standards, we would regard those overworked people as poor, as living in hovels, eating porridge and dying young. But to them, they were not the poor, as there were others poorer than they were. On the other hand, the wealthy at that time were living in stone houses, eating mutton, and had no understanding whatsoever of modern sanitary standards. To us, the wealthy years ago would appear to be poor. But in general, throughout United States history, people have generally classified the poor into three categories. The first is the undeserving poor. And the undeserving poor, we might actually, usually through history, people have just thought these are the people who are just lazy. They don't want to go to school, they don't want to go to work, they don't have much ambition, they don't have much incentive. In certain years in the 17, 18, 1900s, some of these people would have been addicts of one sort or another, very often alcoholics, and back in those days people would have regarded those addictions not as diseases but as moral problems. So again, even our understanding of disease has changed. Then there's the working poor. This really is the vast majority of poor people that we're talking about at any point in time. That is those who work, they have jobs, but they don't earn enough to get by, or they're just literally one paycheck away from disaster. So, if some big problem occurs that their house or the rent is raised, or they're, in the case of nowadays, their car breaks down and they have a big automobile repair, or they have a big medical bill, something, or they lose their job, then they go from working poor to deserving poor, and it's usually a very unhappy situation. The deserving poor, people that we would say are aged, widows and widowers, orphans, the chronically ill, the handicapped. And no one is really questioning this, but in American society, we've always been concerned about how you provide incentives for people to work without them drifting over here into this category of the undeserving poor. Poverty is not easily defined then. It can mean different things at different times. In measuring poverty, since we can't even define poverty, can also be equally tricky and vary. For a detailed discussion of the definition of poverty and its measurements, see your textbook readings for this week from John Iceland's Poverty in America, a Handbook. Now, if we look at poverty, we're looking at causes and remedies. And although many people today realize that there is no panacea, no one solution to poverty, historically people in the U.S. have debated its causes and possible remedies. This course examines historical causes and remedies and tries to do so in an objective manner. And it might say, okay, this didn't work. And we kind of know it didn't work because it was an absolute disaster, this or that thing. And we'll show you an example of that in a minute. But again, we're using evidence-based scholarship to come to those certain conclusions. This lecture provides you with an overview of the historical remedies before the 1930s and hints to the presumed causal explanations of poverty. Through your readings and research, I want you to connect historical explanations of causes and remedies, and by that you'll be using your assigned readings, your unassigned readings, and my lectures and your critical thinking skills of synthesis and analysis. Well, what we can do in terms of showing the overview of remedies to poverty in the United States and even to causes in the United States is to look at two major categories. Before the Great Depression or New Deal of the 1930s, when there were no federal programs, and I underscore that, for the aged, widows, unemployed, handicapped, those injured on the job, etc. And the New Deal and after of the 1930s, when there was an increasing federal role, that is, national government role in poverty. We're going to break down each of these two major categories in our 8-week class into subcategories. And they're going to be as follows. And we're going to look in this lecture at the overview of the before the Great Depression and New Deal of the 1930s. I cannot express, even though this is a slightly old source, The Economy Today, where I learned much of my economic theory, I can't find a better explanation of this. So, excuse me, but we're using this wonderful explanation. Prior to the 1930s, macroeconomists, thought that there never could be a Great Depression. The economic thinkers of the time asserted that the economy was inherently stable. During the 19th century and the first 30 years of the 20th century, the U.S. economy had experienced some bad years in which the nation's output declined and unemployment increased. But most of these episodes were relatively short-lived. The dominant feature of the industrial era was growth. The economy self-adjusts, these classical economic theory adherents thought, to deviations. It self-adjusts to deviations from its long-term growth trend. This is classical economic theory. And it began all the way back in the time of the 1700s with Adam Smith's inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, in which he argued that governments, like Great Britain and others, ought not to be so involved intimately in the economy. Back then, Great Britain was controlling in a mercantilistic fashion the economy of all its colonies and only allowed the colonies to do certain things like provide raw materials. Adam Smith thought that was a bad idea, that the government needed to have a hands-off approach to the economy. It was called laissez-faire economics, a French term meaning to leave alone. The government should leave alone the economy. The invisible hand of the economy and all of these things that you don't see happening, like really supply and demand, that will self-adjust anything that happens. So, how did people help or provide remedies for the poor from colonial times through the American Revolution to circa 1850? The first way is through outdoor relief and almshouses and poorhouses. Outdoor relief was the preferred method of helping the poor. Now, first of all, that does not mean that they forced the poor to live outdoors. No, it means that cities and counties of states in the United States attempted to keep people living not in indoor institutions, but in their places of residence, in their homes, in the places they rent, outside of an institution. So that's why it means outdoor relief. It's outside of an institution, in their homes, by providing them with food, clothing, firewood, or small amounts of money. So take the working poor or the deserving poor. As long as they could take care of themselves or had family or friends or neighbors willing to help them and they could continue to live on their own, then maybe they just needed a little help along the way to get through the tough times. Now you might say, well, gee, that's kind of weird, because what do you do? How do you distinguish between the deserving and the undeserving poor? But remember, in colonial times, the American Revolution, the early 1800s, there weren't as many people in the United States. People knew their neighbors. They knew one another. They knew, because there were fewer people, that this was an easier thing to administer and to monitor. Also, from colonial times to circa 1850, some poor people, especially those without relatives or friends to care for them, were sent to almshouses and poorhouses. Very often these were located in rural areas and included working farms where the able-bodied residents were required to work for their room and board. Now these early poorhouses included under one roof everyone: widows, orphans, children, the healthy and the sick, the handicapped and the able-bodied, even the mentally ill. You can see what a disaster that could lead to. I mean, you have down the hall someone screaming who's, mentally ill, and someone next door to them who has contagious disease, and then a widow next door to them. You can see diseases were being communicated to one another, and it was just a bad environment. Obviously, poorhouses and almshouses, they're not the place you want it to end up being, and they were a disaster as a remedy for poverty. Okay. So by the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, poorhouses, which had not really worked, were replaced by more specialized institutions. For example, where a more suitable environment would be provided for the needs of those who would be institutionalized. So orphanages were places where orphans went. That is, where children went if their parents both died. But please know that orphanages included many children who still had one parent. But back in those days, if the father or mother died, sometimes it was impossible for them to continue to work and take care of the children. So my great-grandmother, Ibis, died. And when she did, my great-grandfather had, a number of children. He could take the oldest boy, who was 11 or 12 years old, to work with him at Stewart Iron Works, and he could help, sweep up and do odd jobs. The other younger children he took to the orphanage. And he kept them there for a number of years until he found a new wife, and he and his new wife then went to the orphanage and picked up the children and then brought them back into their home. Widows' homes, old age homes, hospitals, infirmaries for specialized medical conditions, for contagious diseases like cholera of the time period or tuberculosis. Special residential schools for the blind and deaf. Today we say, the visually impaired and the hearing impaired. In those days, they referred to them as blind and deaf. Mental institutions. Now, a third category. By the 1870s, 1880s, 90s, early 1900s, as science advanced rapidly in the U.S., other professions like social work began to emerge, and they tried to apply scientific principles to their professions. That is the scientific method. Scientific method, you have a hypothesis, it leads to testing, social experiments, etc. Notice scientific charity has two parts: science, so it needed to be scientific, and charity. And it needed to be private charity. They weren't looking for the government involvement, they were looking for private charity to do this. And as surprising as it seems, and perhaps upsetting as it might seem for our eyes, objectively we have to look back, and back in those days, they thought that breaking up families, family breakup, sending children to orphanages, etc., was seen as preferable to keeping them in homes that either were broken by poverty, disease, death, or alcoholism, etc. Not something we do today, but something they did then. Well, that proved not necessarily to kind of work either, so a fourth sort of thing happened called child saving and progressivism. After the economic depression of 1893, during which unemployment reached an estimated 17 to 19% of the workforce, it became increasingly clear that even hardworking, frugal, and abstemious people could suffer poverty. Child saving was an attempt to keep children with worthy parents, that is, to seek preservation of the family unit. And it led to mothers' pensions, so that mothers would not have to go out and work in a factory 12 hours a day, 6-7 days a week, so that they could stay home and take care of their children, especially, if the father had died and this was a single-parent household. Public health programs, juvenile courts, child labor laws, etc. We'll study those more next week. Now, one of the things we do need to look at is prejudice, privilege, and power, and how it has an effect on poverty. I like this comic because it shows a great big line of people lined up to this booth of comforting lies, and no one lined up to this poor guy in his booth of unpleasant truths. And that is, I'm not casting aspersions at anyone, that is you and me, that is all of us at many times in our lives. We would so much rather listen to comforting lies than to have to listen to unpleasant truths. But unfortunately, as objective historians, we need to look at the unpleasant truths as well. Prejudice literally means to prejudge. To judge before you have all of the evidence and facts. Prejudice is more emotionally based and not rationally based. Privilege means to have an exceptional right or advantage. Maybe that's due to the fact that one has, like me, a PhD and a very highly educated postdoctoral education. Maybe it's a doctor. Maybe it's someone who's inherited a lot of wealth or inherited a corporation or whatever. Privilege isn't necessarily a bad thing, and prejudice, again, we all have prejudices. Power can mean many things: political power, economic power, social control. Where it becomes a little problematic is when the three can kind of work together and result in an unhappy situation. So I'm going to give another example of a time period when, as a younger man, I suffered, really from the time that I was a child, but they didn't know what it was back in those days, from GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. We say acid reflux. And how I went to one doctor, and I was very young. I was in my 30s, and just kind of nearing 40. And one day the doctor asked me, this gastrointestinal doctor, he said, "Are you kind of a nervous person?" And I said, "Well, I'm under a lot of stress, so I guess the answer to that would be yes, because at that time I had I was holding down the essence of 2 jobs at Thomas More College where I was. Things were not going well with the one job for a number of reasons, which I won't get into. My mother had just diagnosed with cancer, and I had just been in a major automobile accident. And it was so major, I was a victim of the accident. I didn't cause it. But it shut down the Interstate 75 for several hours, and it was a multi-car thing. And I saw in some things that one can never forget. So anyhow, I answered yes to this. And I found it strange that he was asking that, but he was kind of using his prejudices. He was taking the answer of what I said and kind of leaping to the next conclusions. So he then leapt to the conclusion, unbeknownst to me, it took me a while to figure it out, that maybe I was kind of overestimating, exaggerating the situation of my GERD, and maybe it really wasn't that bad, and maybe I was somewhat of a hypochondriac, and blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, the GERD kept getting worse and worse, and sometimes things would come up and up the esophagus and over into the trachea, and I was having these suffocating incidences. And I figured that more tests needed to be taken. He said, no, you don't need more tests. This is a perfect example of a person with some privilege, obviously a medical doctor, a surgeon who has an impressive education, and so has some privilege, has a prejudice, which he's now used to leap to a new conclusion, and hasn't used any evidence, hasn't taken the next additional steps of the certain tests, medical tests that he should have taken to determine whether or not his prejudice was a reality, his perspective was a reality. He could have continued, if I allowed him, to use his prejudice and privilege to continue to make powerful decisions over my life and my GERD. But I determined to do my own homework and to search for a better specialist. And when I did, that specialist did some tests and found out that I was one of the worst cases that he had ever had, and that had I continued on the program that the prior doctor had me on, I probably would have ended up with esophageal cancer and died within a number of years. Instead, I had some major surgery, and we took care of the problem. That could have been a very unhappy conclusion if I had allowed that former doctor's prejudice privilege to have a sense of power over me. Instead, I sought evidence. I sought the facts. I sought the tests. I sought someone who was objective. And by the way, when I asked for the records from the prior doctor in order to bring those records to the new doctor, and I actually had back in those days to pick them up, I read them over, and everything that he had assumed was true. It was in the records. Basically, he was assuming that, I had some kind of nerve problems or whatever, that maybe I was kind of a hypochondriac. It was all in the medical records, and he was deadly wrong, or could have been deadly wrong. Now, racism is clearly more than simple prejudice or bigotry. Everyone is prejudiced, but not everyone is racist. To be prejudiced means to have opinions without knowing the facts and to hold on to those opinions even after contrary facts are known. To be racially prejudiced means to have distorted opinions about people of other racism. Racism is the power to enforce one's prejudices. More simply, racism is prejudice plus power, and we might extend that definition to say that racism is prejudice plus privilege plus power, and using it for a bad outcome, or an unhappy outcome for someone else. So we have to keep all that in mind when we look at poverty. Also, we need to be very precise about definitions. We need definitions in order to discuss anything in life, especially debate topics. For instance, an apple is not an orange. We need to define what those are. So in economics, we need to define those are. Again, great definition coming from Schiller. Capitalism is an economy in which the factors of production, land, and capital are owned by individuals, and basic allocation decisions are made by market forces. Supply, demand, all of that stuff, price, etc. A social market economy or social capitalism is capitalism, but whereby the government provides very generous social benefits. A socialist market economy has some market mechanisms, but has some socialist mechanisms as well. Socialism is an economy in which all non-labor means of production are owned by the state, which exercises control over resource allocation. And communism, according to Karl Marx, would be where the government would cease to exist because everyone would be equal and there would be no social economic classes. Look at my little handy-dandy chart, and by the way, these categories are very much more modern and cutting edge. Communism, probably have never really seen true communism except through utopian communities in places like New Harmony, Indiana, or among the Shakers. Socialism is represented by the old Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. A socialist market economy would be today's People's Republic of China. A social market economy would be much of today's Europe. And capitalism would be many different places, including the U.S., but note that I have more of a pure form of, and never has there been a pure form of capitalism, but a more pure form of capitalism in the U.S. in the 19th century. And of course, different today and not quite, we're not a pure capitalistic society. Again, no place in the world is a pure capitalistic society, but nonetheless, we have capitalism. Gross domestic product is value of all goods and services produced within a country. For instance, in terms of the United States, all goods and services produced within the U.S., regardless of whether the producer is a U.S. firm or a foreign one located here, whether it is an American worker or a foreign worker residing here. And it consists of 4 different categories, which you can read over. Now, GDP, if we rank the world's largest economies, this is not GDP per capita, per person. That is divided by the population. This is simply the size of the economy. The United States, for many years into the 21st century, in which we are now living, was the world's largest economy. It is now the world's 3rd largest economy, after China and the European Union. Japan has also likewise fallen in ranks. It's now 5th. Germany is now 6th. India is now 4th. And India is continuing to climb. And these are the latest statistics that are available, as you can see over here, taken from the CIA World Factbook, which is a very good source. GDP, we could consider GDP as per capita for each person, in which case the United States has a fairly impressive GDP per capita. Again, it's not the best in the world, but it's pretty good. We used to think that the trade balance, the difference between how much we import it and how much we export it, was the only way to kind of look at the health of an economy. But nowadays we really look at current account balance, which includes 4 categories. It includes this trade balance of exports and goods minus imports and goods. And by the way, the United States by far imports more than it exports, so we have a negative trade balance and have for years. It's also exports of services, not just tangible goods. It's also investments, and it's unilateral transfers. So when we look at all of that, and this is the most recent that I could get, we see that the United States has a negative current account balance of about $456 billion a year. China has the best surplus current account balance at 293, unless you include the whole euro area, which is 343. But if you just look at nations themselves, the U.S. has the highest negative account balance. China, the best surplus account balance, followed by Germany. And there's a number of other nations doing very well as well, the Netherlands, Switzerland, South Korea, etc. Another thing in the news that you need to understand is income inequality is measured by the so-called Gini index. You can find this Gini index or other indexes of income equality done by many nonprofit and objective groups and organizations throughout the United States and the world. This particular one comes from Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. You can look at all these different places, and please note that the closer you are to 0, the more you are to complete equality. The closer you are to 1, so the higher up on this chart, the more unequal your income distribution is. Please note where the United States is in this list of OECD countries. It's the 3rd worst in terms of income equality, followed by Turkey and Mexico. This all becomes important, and we're going to bring it home to you by looking, and feel free to look at this or any number of other links on the internet. As of 2012, 13, thereabouts, Cincinnati had the second worst of all large U.S. cities in terms of the percentage of children living in poverty. It was like 53% of the children in Cincinnati were living in poverty. That has been brought down over the past few years. It's now in the 40%, but some people assume that that's because there's a lot of rehab and a lot of people with money moving into the city and many of the poor moving out of the city. I said I'd show you examples of a bibliography. This is an example of a bibliography. I show you how to do this and break it down for books with multiple authors, articles, websites, book reviews, and when in doubt, just try to be thorough or ask me. Any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help, and have a great week.